This woman smiles in the photo, but the truth behind the portrait is dark. Dr. Marcus Thompson had been cataloging Victorian-era photographs at the Chicago Historical Society for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he found in a dusty box marked Unclaimed Estate Photos, 1882. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2018 when he lifted a cardboard-mounted photograph from the collection and felt his breath catch in his throat. The image was a formal studio portrait, typical of the 1880s. A woman sat in an ornate chair, wearing an elaborate dark dress with lace collar, her blonde hair styled in the fashion of the era. Her eyes were open, staring directly at the camera with an unsettling stillness. Her lips were curved into a slight smile. Standing beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, was a well-dressed black man in his 30s, wearing a fine suit with a watch chain visible across his vest. At first glance, Marcus thought it was simply an unusual photograph for the period. A white woman and a black man posing together in the 1880s would have been extraordinary enough. But something about the woman's expression made him look closer. Her eyes, though open, had a glazed quality. Her smile seemed fixed, unnatural. Her posture was too still, too perfect. Marcus had studied enough Victorian photography to recognize what he was seeing. This was a post-mortem photograph, a common practice in the era when families wanted one last image of their deceased loved ones. But post-mortem subjects were usually photographed with closed eyes, positioned to look peacefully asleep. This woman's eyes were wide open, staring at the camera. Someone had wanted her to appear alive. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded brown ink, someone had written, "Margaret and Samuel, Thompson Studio, Chicago, April 14th, 1882. Below that, in different handwriting, smaller and harder to read, the only photograph, taken 3 hours after her passing. May God forgive us all. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He set the photograph on his desk and stared at it under the lamp. The man's face, Samuel, showed such profound grief that it was almost unbearable to look at. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw tight. His hand on her shoulder trembled slightly, creating a blur in the otherwise sharp image. But it was Margaret's expression that haunted Mark. Her eyes were open, yes, but there was something else, a smile. Someone had positioned her face, perhaps manipulated her features, to create the appearance of a smile. In death, they had made her look happy. Marcus pulled out his magnifying glass and examined every detail of the image. The studio backdrop showed a painted garden scene. Fresh flowers sat in a vase beside the chair, white roses and lilies, funeral flowers. Margaret's left hand rested in her lap, and on her ring finger was a simple gold band. Samuel wore an identical ring. Marcus spent the next 3 days researching Thompson's studio. He discovered it had operated on the south side of Chicago from 1875 to 1889, owned by a photographer named Albert Thompson who specialized in both living portraits and post-mortem photography. The studio had served a mixed clientele, unusual for the time, including some of Chicago's small but growing black middle class. He found the studio's ledger book in the Historical Society's archives. The entries were meticulous, listing each client, the type of photograph, and the price. Marcus flipped through pages of names until he found the entry for April 14th, 1882. Samuel Bennett, special memorial portrait, $5 paid in full. Note, client insists subject's eyes remain open. Unusual request, honored. $5 was an enormous sum in 1882, nearly a week's wages for most workers. Samuel had paid a premium for this photograph and for the photographer's discretion in creating something that violated the normal conventions of post-mortem photography. But it was what Marcus found next that made him realize this was more than just an unusual Victorian death portrait. In the Historical Society's newspaper archives, he searched for any mention of Margaret and Samuel Bennett in April 1882. What he found was a single brief article in the Chicago Tribune, dated April 16th, 1882, buried on page 7, "Woman dies in childbirth." Margaret Wilson, age 26, died Friday evening during labor at a residence on Dearborn Street. The child did not survive. No family has come forward to claim the body. The deceased was reportedly residing with a Negro man, circumstances unknown. The coroner has ruled the death natural causes, burial arrangements pending. Margaret Wilson, not Margaret Bennett. The newspaper hadn't acknowledged a marriage, hadn't mentioned Samuel by name, only as a Negro man. Marcus felt his hands trembling as he held the microfilm reader's printout. He searched marriage records for Cook County, Illinois, looking for any record of Margaret Wilson and Samuel Bennett. He searched from 1870 through 1882. Nothing. He expanded his search to surrounding counties. Still nothing. He tried other states where interracial marriage might have been legal during that period. There were only a handful. Finally, in the Massachusetts State Archives, he found it. Marriage license issued September 3rd, 1879. Samuel Bennett, Negro, age 27, laborer, and Margaret Wilson, white, age 23, seamstress, both of Boston, Massachusetts. They had been legally married in Massachusetts. But when they moved to Illinois, their marriage wasn't recognized. In Illinois in 1882, interracial marriage was illegal. Their marriage certificate meant nothing. In the eyes of Illinois law, they were not husband and wife. Samuel was simply a Negro man living with a white woman, an arrangement that could bring violence, arrest, or worse. Marcus looked back at the photograph. Samuel's hand on Margaret's shoulder, the matching rings. The desperate attempt to create one image where they existed together as what they truly were, husband and wife. Marcus knew he needed to find out more about Samuel Bennett. The 1880 Census for Chicago listed a Samuel Bennett, black male, age 28, occupation carpenter. The address was on Dearborn Street, the same street mentioned in the newspaper article about Margaret's death. He searched through city directories, property records, and business licenses. Samuel had been skilled and industrious. In 1880, he was listed as a carpenter. By 1881, he had opened a small furniture workshop. He was building a life, establishing himself in a city where black men faced enormous barriers to economic advancement. Then Marcus found something extraordinary. A legal document filed in Cook County Court in October 1879, just weeks after Samuel and Margaret's marriage in Massachusetts. It was a petition filed by Samuel Bennett requesting recognition of his Massachusetts marriage license in Illinois. The petition was written in formal legal language, but the emotion behind it was palpable. I, Samuel Bennett, a free man and citizen of these United States, hereby petition this court to recognize the lawful marriage contracted between myself and Margaret Wilson on September 3rd, 1879, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We are husband and wife before God and under the law of Massachusetts. We seek only to live peacefully as a married couple in this city. The petition was denied. The judge's ruling was brief and cold. Marriage between Negro and white persons is prohibited under Illinois law. The petition is denied. The alleged marriage contracted in Massachusetts has no legal standing in this jurisdiction. Marcus found another document from 1880. Samuel had tried again, this time with an attorney, arguing that the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution required Illinois to recognize a valid Massachusetts marriage. Again denied. Samuel had fought for 2 years to have his marriage recognized. He had spent money he probably couldn't afford on lawyers and court fees. He had put himself at risk, a black man publicly demanding his rights in 1880s Chicago, insisting that a white woman was his legal wife. And he had failed. In the eyes of Illinois law, Margaret was not his wife. Their love, their commitment, their marriage ceremony in Boston, none of it mattered. They lived together anyway, knowing the danger. Samuel worked. Margaret took in sewing. They built a quiet life together in a city that refused to acknowledge their marriage. Then, in April 1882, Margaret went into labor. Something went wrong. In an era before modern medicine, childbirth was dangerous for all women, but especially for those without access to good medical care. Did Samuel call a doctor? Would a doctor come to help a white woman living with a black man? The newspaper said nothing about medical attendance. Margaret died. So did their child. And Samuel was left alone with a grief that no one would acknowledge, because officially he had lost nothing. She wasn't his wife. The child wasn't his child. He was just a Negro man whose arrangement had ended. Marcus needed to understand why Albert Thompson, the photographer, had agreed to take such a photograph. In 1882, Chicago, creating a portrait of a deceased white woman with a black man would have been dangerous, not just socially scandalous, but potentially violent. Thompson was risking his business, perhaps even his safety. He searched for more information about Thompson's studio and found something remarkable. Albert Thompson had been a Union Army photographer during the Civil War. He had documented battlefields, soldiers, and the conditions of freed slaves in contraband camps. After the war, he had settled in Chicago and opened his studio. In the Chicago Historical Society's archives, Marcus found a collection of Thompson's personal papers that had been donated decades earlier but never fully cataloged. Inside were business records, correspondence, and a journal Thompson had kept sporadically. The journal entry from April 14, 1882 was brief but powerful. A colored man came to the studio today with a request that troubled me greatly. His wife, though he cannot call her that legally in this state, had died the previous night in childbirth. He wanted a photograph, together. Just one photograph where they could exist as husband and wife. He showed me their marriage certificate from Massachusetts. Legal there, meaningless here. He wept as he spoke. Said they had never had a photograph taken together. Too dangerous. People would ask questions. There could be violence. But now she was gone and he wanted one image. Just one. To prove they had existed. To prove she had been his wife. I told him I would do it, though I knew the risks. He carried her body to the studio himself, wrapped in clean linens. We positioned her in the chair. He insisted her eyes be open. Said he couldn't bear to photograph her sleeping. Wanted her to be looking at him one last time. I have photographed many dead in my years. Soldiers, children, elderly. But never have I felt such profound sorrow as I did watching this man position his wife's body, arrange her dress, try to coax a smile onto her face. He whispered to her the entire time. Told her he loved her. Asked her forgiveness for bringing her to a place that wouldn't recognize their marriage. When the photograph was complete, he paid me $5, more than I usually charge. He held the wet plate as it developed, staring at the image forming. Then he carried her body back home. I do not know what became of him. I do not know if he was ever able to bury her properly or if she was placed in a potter's field with no name. But I know this. I witnessed love today. Real love. The kind that persists despite laws, despite hatred, despite death itself. Marcus sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a post-mortem photograph. This was an act of defiance. Samuel had brought his wife's body to a photographer, carrying her through the streets to create evidence of their marriage that the law refused to acknowledge. Marcus realized he knew almost nothing about Margaret. The historical record had reduced her to a brief obituary. Margaret Wilson, aged 26, died. He needed to find out who she had been before she became a name in a death notice. He searched census records and found her family. Margaret Wilson had been born in 1856 in Springfield, Illinois, to Irish immigrant parents. Her father, Thomas Wilson, was a railroad worker. Her mother, Catherine, had died in 1872 when Margaret was 16. The 1870 census showed Margaret living with her parents and 3 younger siblings. By 1880, Margaret wasn't listed in her father's household anymore. Marcus searched city directories and found her in Chicago, listed as a seamstress, boarding at a house on State Street, a respectable boarding house for working women. Then he found something that provided crucial context. A letter preserved in a collection of papers from the Chicago Women's Trade Union. The letter was dated August 1879, written by Margaret Wilson to her younger sister Emma, who still lived in Springfield. The letter had been preserved because Emma had later donated her sister's correspondence to a women's organization, wanting to document the lives of working women in the 1880s. Marcus's hand shook as he read, "Dearest Emma, I must tell you something that will shock you, but I hope you will understand. I have met someone. His name is Samuel. He is kind and good and works as a carpenter. He is also a Negro. I know what people will say. I know Father would be furious. But, Emma, he treats me with such respect and gentleness. We have spent months walking together in the evenings, talking about everything, books, politics, our dreams for the future. He wants to marry me. I want to marry him. We are traveling to Boston next week, where such marriages are legal. I do not know what will come of this. I know we will face hatred and difficulty. But I also know that I love him, and he loves me, and that must count for something. Please do not tell Father yet. I will write to him when the time is right. Perhaps he will understand. Perhaps not. But I must follow my heart. Your loving sister, Margaret." Marcus found no record of Margaret ever writing to her father. Thomas Wilson died in 1885, 3 years after Margaret. His obituary listed his surviving children, Emma and 2 sons, but made no mention of Margaret. She had been erased from the family record. He searched for Emma and found her in the 1900 census, married with children of her own. In a Chicago newspaper from 1901, there was a small notice about a women's suffrage meeting. Emma Wilson Harris had spoken about her sister Margaret, who had died tragically young, and whose marriage was not recognized by unjust laws. Emma had remembered. Emma had kept her sister's letters. Emma had tried, in her own way, to ensure Margaret's story wasn't completely forgotten. As Marcus continued his research, he discovered that Samuel and Margaret hadn't been alone. There was a small hidden community of interracial couples in 1880s Chicago, people who lived quietly, carefully, always aware of the danger they faced. He found evidence of this community in unexpected places. Church records from a small Presbyterian church on the south side showed several marriages performed for interracial couples, though the minister noted that these were spiritual unions, since Illinois wouldn't recognize them legally. Property records showed a few homes owned by black men where white women also resided, though never listed as wives, sometimes as housekeepers or boarders, paper-thin disguises that fooled no one but provided minimal legal protection. Newspaper archives revealed the violence these couples faced. An 1881 article described an attack on a home where a black man and white woman lived together. The mob had broken windows and threatened to burn the house. Police had arrested the couple for lewd cohabitation, rather than protecting them from the mob. A coroner's inquest from 1883 investigated the death of a white woman named Catherine Moore, found beaten to death in an alley. The inquest revealed she had been married to a black man named James Moore in Ohio, where their marriage was legal. When they moved to Chicago, they faced constant harassment. Her family had disowned her. Witnesses reported seeing a group of white men following her on the night she died. No one was ever arrested for her murder. Marcus found a memoir published in 1920 by a Chicago minister who had worked in the South Side in the 1880s. In it, he wrote, "There existed in those days a number of couples who had legally married in other states, but found themselves unrecognized and persecuted in Illinois. They lived in constant fear, not just of legal persecution, but of violence from neighbors who saw their unions as abominations. Many of these couples lost everything. Families who disowned them, jobs they couldn't keep, homes they were driven from. Some disappeared entirely, and one suspects the worst. The courage it took to maintain a relationship under such circumstances was extraordinary. These were love stories forged in the face of hatred." Samuel and Margaret had been part of this hidden community. They had found each other, married legally where they could, and then tried to build a life in a place that denied their humanity. They had lived knowing that any day might bring violence, that Margaret's family might never speak to her again, that Samuel could be arrested on manufactured charges at any moment, and they had done it anyway. For 3 years, they had built a home together. They had hoped for a future. They had conceived a child. Then, in one terrible night, it had all ended. Marcus realized he still didn't know what had happened after the photograph was taken. Where was Margaret buried? What became of Samuel? He searched cemetery records throughout Chicago, looking for Margaret Wilson or Margaret Bennett, buried in April 1882. He found her in the records of Oak Woods Cemetery, a large cemetery on the south side. The entry was stark. Margaret Wilson died April 13, 1882, aged 26. Cause, childbirth. Buried April 16, 1882. Section 12, Lot 847. Burial paid by S. Bennett. Section 12 was the Potter's Field, the area reserved for paupers, criminals, and those without family to claim them. Unmarked graves, dozens of bodies buried in shared plots. Margaret had been placed there, her grave unmarked, her name recorded only in a ledger, but Samuel had paid for the burial. Marcus found the receipt in the cemetery's financial records, $3. This was zero paid by Samuel Bennett for burial of Margaret Wilson. It was all he could afford, but he had ensured she was buried properly, not simply disposed of. Marcus visited Oakwood Cemetery on a cold morning in April, almost exactly 136 years after Margaret's burial. Section 12 was a flat, grassy area with a few weathered stones marking the boundaries. There were no individual markers. Hundreds of people lay beneath that ground, their names forgotten, their stories lost. He stood there, looking at the grass, knowing Margaret was somewhere beneath his feet. She had been 26 years old. She had loved Samuel. She had married him despite knowing the price she would pay. She had carried his child. She had died bringing that child into a world that would have rejected it as cruelly as it had rejected their marriage. And Samuel had carried her body through the streets of Chicago to a photographer's studio to create one image, one piece of evidence that their love had existed, that their marriage had been real, that she had been his wife. Marcus pulled out his phone and took a photograph of Section 12, an unmarked field, anonymous earth. But he knew the truth now. Margaret was there, and her story, finally, would be told. Back at the Historical Society, Marcus continued searching for traces of Samuel. What had happened to him after Margaret's death? Had he stayed in Chicago? Had he survived? The trail was faint, but he found pieces. In the 1883 city directory, Samuel Bennett was no longer listed at the Dearborn Street address. The furniture workshop was gone. Marcus found a property record showing the workshop had been sold in August 1882, 4 months after Margaret's death, for a fraction of its value. Then, nothing. Samuel disappeared from Chicago records entirely. Marcus expanded his search beyond Chicago. If Samuel had left the city after Margaret's death, where would he have gone? He searched census records, city directories, death certificates, anywhere Samuel Bennett might have appeared. In the 1890 census, 8 years after Margaret's death, Marcus found him. Samuel Bennett, black male, age 38, occupation, carpenter residing in Detroit, Michigan. He was living in a boarding house, unmarried, working in a furniture factory. Marcus found more traces. A city directory from 1895 listed Samuel Bennett as owning a small carpentry shop on Gratiot Avenue in Detroit. He was building a life again, slowly, carefully. Then, in a collection of papers from a Detroit church, Marcus found something extraordinary. A letter written by Samuel in 1896 to the pastor of Second Baptist Church, a prominent black church in Detroit. The letter was a request to join the church, and in it, Samuel told part of his story. "Reverend, I come to you seeking a spiritual home. I have been alone for many years now. I was married once, lawfully before God, in Massachusetts in 1879. My wife was named Margaret. She was a good woman, a Christian woman. We were happy, though the world made our happiness difficult. She died in Chicago in 1882, along with our unborn child. I have carried the grief of that loss every day since. I left Chicago because I could not bear to remain in the place where we had tried to build our life together. I have lived quietly here in Detroit, working, attending services when I could, but I have not truly been part of a community. I am ready now to belong again, to be part of a church family. I am not asking for pity. I am asking for a place to worship and to serve. Your servant in Christ, Samuel Bennett." The pastor's note at the bottom of the letter read, "Mr. Bennett was welcomed into our congregation on Easter Sunday, 1896. He is a man of deep faith and quiet dignity." Marcus found Samuel's name in the church records for the next 15 years. He attended services regularly. He taught carpentry skills to young men in the church's vocational program. He donated what he could to the church's charity fund. He was a respected member of the community. In 1911, the church newsletter included a brief announcement. "We mourn the passing of our brother Samuel Bennett, who died peacefully on March 12th at the age of 59. Brother Bennett was a faithful member of our congregation for 15 years and will be remembered for his kindness, his skill, and his generous spirit. He is survived by no immediate family, but he was family to us all." Samuel was buried in Detroit's Elmwood Cemetery, in a section designated for members of Second Baptist Church. His grave had a simple marker: Samuel Bennett, 1852-1911, beloved brother in Christ. Marcus made arrangements to travel to Detroit. He needed to see Samuel's grave to complete the circle of this story. Standing in Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit, Marcus looked at Samuel's gravestone. It was modest, but well-maintained, in a section with dozens of other graves from the same church community. Samuel had found belonging here eventually. He had been remembered, mourned, laid to rest with dignity. But Marcus thought about the photograph. Samuel had lived 29 years after Margaret's death. He had rebuilt his life, found a community, done good work, but he had never remarried. He had carried Margaret with him for nearly 3 decades, the only woman he ever called his wife. Marcus had brought a copy of the photograph with him. He placed it on Samuel's gravestone and took a picture with his phone, the photograph of the photograph, creating a connection across time. Samuel and Margaret reunited at least in memory. Back in Chicago, Marcus prepared to publish his findings. He knew the story would resonate powerfully in 2018, a year when conversations about race, love, and justice were dominating national discourse. But he wanted to do more than just write an academic article. He wanted Margaret and Samuel's story to reach people, to make them understand what love looked like in the face of hatred. He contacted a journalist at the Chicago Tribune, the same newspaper that had reduced Margaret to a 3-line obituary in 1882. The journalist, a woman named Patricia Chen, was immediately interested. She came to the Historical Society to see the photograph and read through Marcus's research. Patricia stared at the photograph for a long time. Her eyes are open, she said quietly. She's looking right at the camera, right at us. Samuel insisted on that, Marcus explained. The photographer wrote about it. He couldn't bear to photograph her sleeping. He wanted her to be looking at him one last time. Patricia turned the photograph over, reading the inscription. The only photograph, taken 3 hours after her passing. May God forgive us all. She looked up at Marcus. Who wrote that? The photographer? I believe so. Thompson felt the weight of what he was documenting. Not just death, but injustice. A marriage that was legal in one state but criminal in another. A love that existed despite laws designed to make it impossible. Patricia began writing the article that week. She interviewed Marcus extensively, reviewed all his research, and visited both Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago and Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit. She found descendants of Emma, Margaret's sister, and showed them the photograph and letters Marcus had discovered. One of Emma's great-granddaughters, a woman named Rachel, wept when she saw the photograph. We always knew there was a sister, she said. My grandmother mentioned Margaret a few times, said she had married someone the family didn't approve of, and that she died young. But that's all we knew. We didn't know about Samuel. We didn't know she'd been happy, that she'd chosen love over family approval. I wish I'd known her. The Tribune article was published on February 14th, 2019, Valentine's Day. Patricia had titled it, The Only Photograph, A Love Story That Illinois Law Refused to Recognize. The article went viral. Within hours, it was being shared across social media, discussed on news programs, and picked up by national media outlets. People were captivated by the photograph, by Margaret's open eyes and fixed smile, by Samuel's grief-stricken face, by the single image that documented a marriage Illinois had denied existed. But more than that, people were moved by the story of love persisting against impossible odds. Margaret and Samuel had married knowing they would face hatred, violence, and legal persecution. They had built a life together anyway. They had conceived a child together. And when Margaret died, Samuel had done something extraordinary. He had carried her body through the streets to create one photograph that proved what the law denied, that she had been his wife. The story sparked conversations about the long history of anti-miscegenation laws in America. These laws had existed in many states well into the 20th century. The Supreme Court didn't strike them down nationwide until 1967 with the Loving v. Virginia decision. Millions of couples had been affected by these laws, their marriages denied, their families torn apart. The photograph of Margaret and Samuel became a symbol. Museums requested permission to display it. Educators used it in lessons about the history of racism and resistance. A playwright in Boston wrote a play based on their story. The photograph that Samuel had risked everything to create was finally being seen, finally bearing witness to their love. Marcus worked with the Historical Society to create a proper memorial. In Oakwood Cemetery, in Section 12, where Margaret lay in an unmarked grave, they installed a memorial stone. Margaret Wilson Bennett, 1856-1882, beloved wife of Samuel Bennett, married legally in Massachusetts, September 3rd, 1879. Their love transcended unjust laws. In Detroit, Second Baptist Church added a plaque near Samuel's grave. Samuel Bennett, 1852-1911, husband of Margaret Wilson Bennett. He loved faithfully, lived with dignity, and never forgot. The photograph remained at the Chicago Historical Society, but it was no longer filed away in a box. It was displayed prominently with the full story of Margaret and Samuel beside it. Visitors stood before it, reading about the couple who had married in Boston, lived in Chicago, and died apart. Margaret in 1882, Samuel in 1911, but who had loved each other across the divide of death and law. Marcus often visited the photograph. He would stand before it, looking at Margaret's open eyes staring out from 1882, at Samuel's hand on her shoulder, at the matching rings on their fingers. He thought about the courage it took to love someone when the law declared that love criminal. He thought about Samuel carrying Margaret's body through the streets, about the photographer who risked his business to document their marriage, about the single image that survived when everything else had been taken from them. The photograph looked like a normal Victorian portrait. A woman and a man formally posed in a studio. But behind that image was a story of profound love and profound injustice. A story of a marriage that was legal in one state but criminal in another. A A story of a woman who chose love over family approval and paid with her life. A story of a man who spent 29 years mourning his wife and never stopped calling her by that name, even when the law said he had no right to. The truth behind the portrait was dark. A darkness of laws designed to destroy love, of violence meant to enforce hatred, of a society that valued racial purity over human happiness. But within that darkness, there was light. The light of Margaret and Samuel's love, which had persisted despite everything. The light of their courage in choosing each other. The light of the photograph itself, which had survived 137 years to finally tell their story. And now, finally, people knew. The woman smiling in the photograph had loved and been loved. She had been someone's wife. Her death had been mourned. Her memory had been carried for decades by a man who never forgot her. The photograph that should never have existed, the photograph that documented a marriage Illinois refused to recognize, had become proof of something the law couldn't destroy. That love, real love, transcends everything.